Probably it was in deference to similar views more vigorously expressed that the Americans decided to make the gesture of depth bombing the Cayman Trench, close to the point where the Carib Princess had vanished. They can scarcely have expected any decisive result from the random bombing of a deep some 50 miles wide and 400 miles long. The occasion was well publicized on both sides of the Atlantic. American citizens were proud that their forces were taking the lead in reprisals. British citizens, though vocal in their dissatisfaction at being left standing at the post when the recent loss of 2 great ships should have given them the greater incentive to swift action, decided to applaud the occasion loudly as a gesture of reproof to their own leaders. The flotilla of 10 vessels commissioned for the task was reported as carrying a number of HE bombs specially designed for great depth, as well as 2 atomic bombs. It put out from Chesapeake Bay amid an acclamation which entirely drowned the voice of Cuba plaintively protesting at the prospect of atomic bombs on her doorstep. None of those who heard the broadcast put out from one of the vessels as the task force neared the chosen area will ever forget the sequel. The voice of the announcer, when it suddenly broke off from his description of the scene to say sharply, "Something seems to be... My God, she's blown up." And then the boom of the explosion. The announcer gabbling incoherently, then a second boom, a clatter, a sound of confusion and voices, a clanging of bells. Then the announcer's voice again, breath short, sounding unsteady, talking fast. "That explosion you heard, the first one, was the destroyer, Cavort. She has entirely disappeared. Second explosion was the frigate, Redwood. She has disappeared too. The Redwood was carrying one of our 2 atomic bombs. It's gone down with her. It is constructed to operate by pressure at 5 miles depth. The other 8 ships of the flotilla are dispersing at full speed to get away from the danger area. We shall have a few minutes to get clear. I don't know how long. Nobody here can tell me. A few minutes, we think. Every ship in sight is using every ounce of power to get away from the area before the bomb goes off. The deck is shuddering under us. We're going flat out. Everyone's looking back at the place where the Redwood went down. Hey, doesn't anybody here know how long it'll take that thing to sink 5 miles? Hell, somebody must know. We're pulling away for all we're worth. All the other ships, too, all getting the hell out of it as fast as we can make it. Anyone know what the area of the main spouts reckon to be? For Christ's sake, doesn't anybody know any damn thing around here? We're pulling off now, pulling off. Maybe we will make it. Wish I knew how long. Maybe. Faster now, faster, for heaven's sake. Pull the guts out of her. What's it matter? Hell, slog her to bits. Cram her along. 5 minutes now since the Redwood sank. How far will she be down in 5 minutes? For God's sake, somebody... How long does that damn thing take to sink? Still going, still keeping going, still beating it for all we're worth. Surely to heaven we must be beyond the main spout area by now. Must have a chance now. We're keeping it up. Still going flat out. Everybody looking astern. Everybody watching and waiting for it. And we're still going. How can a thing be sinking all this time? But thank God it is. Over 7 minutes now. Nothing yet. Still going. And the other ships with great white wakes behind them. Still going. Maybe it's a dud. Or maybe the bottom isn't 5 miles around here. Why can't somebody tell us how long it ought to take? Must be getting clear of the worst now. Some of the other ships are just black dots on white spots now. Still going. We're still hammering away. Must have a chance now. I guess we've really got a chance now. Everybody's still staring aft. Oh, God, the whole sea's... And there it cut off. But he survived, that radio announcer. His ship and 5 others out of the flotilla of 10 came through, a bit radioactive, but otherwise unharmed. And I understand that the first thing that happened to him when he reported back to his office after treatment was a reprimand for the use of over-colloquial language, which had given offence to a number of listeners by its neglect of the third commandment. That was the day on which arguments stopped and propaganda became unnecessary. 2 of the 4 ships lost in the Cayman Trench disaster had succumbed to the bomb, but the end of the other 2 had occurred in a glare of publicity that routed the sceptics and the cautious alike. At last it was established beyond doubt that there was something, and a highly dangerous something too, down there in the deeps. Such was the wave of alarmed conviction spreading swiftly round the world that even the Russians sufficiently overcame their national reticence to admit that they had lost 1 large freighter and 1 unspecified naval vessel, both again off the Kurils, and 1 more survey craft off eastern Kamchatka. In consequence of this, they were, they said, willing to cooperate with other powers in putting down this menace to the cause of world peace. The following day, the British government proposed that an international naval conference should meet in London to make a preliminary survey of the problem. A disposition among some of those invited to quibble about the locale was quenched by the unsympathetically urgent mood of the public. The conference assembled in Westminster within 3 days of the announcement, and as far as England was concerned, none too soon. In those 3 days, cancellations of sea passages had been wholesale. Overwhelmed airline companies had been forced to apply priority schedules. The government had clamped down fast on the sales of oils of all kinds, and was rushing out a rationing system for essential services. The bottom had dropped out of the shipping market, the price of many foodstuffs had doubled, and all kinds of tobacco had vanished under the counters. On the day before the conference opened, Phyllis and I had met for lunch. "You ought to see Oxford Street," she said. "Talk about panic buying, cottons particularly. Every hopeless line is selling out at double prices, and they're scratching one another's eyes out for things they wouldn't have been seen dead in last week. Every decent piece of stuff has disappeared, presumably into store for later on. It's a better picnic than any of the sales." "From what they tell me in the city," I told her, "it's about as good there. Sounds as if you could get control of a shipping line for a few bob, but you couldn't buy a single share in anything to do with aircraft for a fortune. Steel's all over the place, rubbers are too, plastics are soaring, distilleries are down. About the only thing that's holding its own seems to be breweries. I saw a man and a woman loading 2 sacks of coffee beans into a Rolls in Piccadilly. And there were—" She broke off suddenly as though what I had been saying had just registered. "You did get rid of Aunt Mary's shares in those Jamaican plantations?" she inquired, with the expression that she applies to the monthly housekeeping accounts. "Some time ago," I reassured her. "The proceeds went, oddly enough, into aero-engines and plastics." She gave an approving nod, rather as if the instructions had been hers. Then another thought occurred to her. "What about the press tickets for tomorrow?" she asked. "There aren't any for the conference proper," I told her. "There will be a statement afterwards." She stared at me. "Aren't any? For heaven's sake, what do they think they're doing?" I shrugged. "Force of habit, I imagine. They're planning a campaign. When you plan a campaign, you tell the press as much as it is good for it to know later on." "Well, of all I know, darling, but you can't expect a service to change its spots overnight. It's absolutely silly. More like Russia every day. Where's the telephone in this place?" "Darling, this is an international conference. You can't just go—" "Of course I can. It's sheer nonsense." "Well, whatever VIP you have in mind will be out at lunch now," I pointed out. That checked her for a moment. She brooded. "I never heard of such rubbish. How do they expect us to do our job?" she muttered, and brooded some more. When Phyllis said "our job," the words did not connote exactly what they would have implied a few days before. The job had somehow changed quality under our feet. The task of persuading the public of the reality of the unseen, indescribable menace had turned suddenly into one of keeping up morale in the face of a menace which everyone now accepted to the point of panic. EBC ran a feature called News Parade, in which we appeared to have assumed, as far as we understood the position, the roles of special oceanic correspondents, without being quite sure how it had occurred. In point of fact, Phyllis had never been on the EBC staff, and I had technically left it when I ceased officially to have an office there some 2 years before. Nobody, however, seemed to be aware of this, except the accounts department, which now paid by the piece instead of by the month. We had been briefed together on this change to a morale-sustaining angle by a director who was clearly under the impression that we were part of his staff. The whole situation was anomalous, but not unrewarding. All the same, there was not going to be much freshness of treatment in our assignment if we could get no nearer to the sources than official handouts. Phyllis was still brooding about it when I left her to go back to the office I officially didn't have in EBC. She rang me up there about 5. "Darling," she said, "you've invited Dr. Matet to dine with you at your club at 7:30 tomorrow evening. I shall be there too." I explained how it was, and he quite agreed that it was a lot of nonsense. I tried to get Captain Winters to come as well, as he's a friend of his. He thought it was a lot of nonsense too, but he said that the service was the service and he'd better not come, so I'm having lunch with him tomorrow. You don't mind? I don't quite see why the service should be less the service tete-a-tete, I told her, but I appreciate the matet move. So, darling, you may pat yourself on the back, because this town must now be full of assorted ographers that he's not set eyes on for years. He'll be seeing plenty of them by day, Phyllis said modestly. This time there was no need for Phyllis to coax Dr. Matet. He started off like a man with a mission over sherries in the bar. The service makes its own rules, of course, he said, but no pledges were required from the rest of us, so I choose to regard myself as at liberty to discuss the proceedings. I think it's a duty to let people know all the main facts. You've heard the official pronouncement, of course? We had. It amounted to little more than advice to all shipping to keep clear of the major deeps when possible until further notice. One imagined that many masters would already have taken this decision for themselves, but now they would at least have official advice to quote in any argument with their owners. Not very specific, I told him. One of our draftsmen for television has produced a work of bathymetric, or do I mean hydrographic art, showing areas over 20,000 feet. Very pleased with it he was, but last seen tearing his hair because someone had told him that it's not technically a deep unless it's over 25,000. For present purposes, the danger area is being reckoned as anything over 4,000, said Dr. Matet. What? I exclaimed wildly. Fathoms, added Dr. Matet. 24,000 feet, darling. You multiply by 6, said Phyllis kindly. She ignored my thanks and went on to Dr. Matet. And what depth did you advise as marking the danger area, Doctor? How did you know I did not advise 4,000 fathoms, Mrs. Watson? Use of the passive, Dr. Matet, is being reckoned, Phyllis told him, smiling sweetly. And there are people who claim that French is the subtle language, he said. Well, I'll admit that I recommended that 3,500 should be regarded as the safe maximum, but the shipping interests were all for keeping the extra distances involved as low as possible. Well, isn't this supposed to be a naval conference? Phyllis asked. Oh, they have the real say on strategy, of course, but this was in the first general session, and anyway, the navies agreed. You see, the more sea they declare unsafe, the worse it is for their prestige. Oh dear, is it going to be one of those conferences, said Phyllis. Less so than most, I hope, Dr. Matet replied. We went in to dinner. Phyllis prattled lightly through the soup and then steered gracefully back to the topic. The first time I came to see you was about that ooze that was coming up into currents, and you were dreadfully careful. What did you really think then? He smiled. The same as I think now, that if you get yourself made a kind of mental outlaw, you also make your purposes very much harder to attain. Poor old Bocker. Though everybody's had to come round to accepting the second part of his contention now, yet he's still out beyond the pale. I could not afford to say it, but I believed then that he was right about the mining. One could think of nothing else that would account for it, so, as the genius of Baker Street once remarked to your husband's namesake, I headed him off. But you didn't want to join Bocker in the wilderness. I did not. Nor have I been by any means the only one. Bocker's miscarriage warned us all to allow full gestation. Incidentally, I suppose you know that there have been further discolorations of currents, and that those first discoloured have returned to normal? Yes, Captain Winters told me. What do you think would cause that? Phyllis asked, just as one might who had not immediately rung up Bocker the moment she heard it to demand an explanation. Well, pursuing the mining theory, one would suggest that all the loose sediment near the scene of operations would gradually be washed away. Imagine sticking the end of a suction pipe into sand. At first you'd get sand coming through it, and you'd create a funnel-shaped depression. After a while you'd reach rock, but there'd still be some sand trickling down the sides of your depression, and having to be sucked clear. In time, however, your depression would be of such a shape that very little sand, which of course represents the sedimental ooze, would trickle down, and you would be able to work on the cleared rock face without disturbing the surrounding sand or ooze at all. But of course on the seabed the scale of such an operation would be immense, and a colossal quantity of ooze would have to be shifted before you could get to a rock face that would remain clear. It would certainly be better to mine horizontally where possible. Once work on the rock itself had begun, the detritus would be too heavy to rise more than a few hundred feet before it began to settle, so the surface water would no longer be discoloured. No one observing Phyllis's rapt attention would have suspected that she had already made use of this theory in a script. "I see you make it easy to understand, Doctor. Then the various discolorations will have enabled you to locate quite closely where this mining is going on. With reasonable accuracy, I think," he agreed. "And so, of course, those spots become priority targets. In fact, to be honest, the only closely localized targets so far." "There'll be an attack on them, then?" "Soon?" Phyllis asked. He shook his head. "Not my side of things, but I imagine that any delay will be due simply to technical reasons. How much of the sea can we afford to poison with atomic weapons? Are we to risk ships on the task? Or how long will it take to construct a depth bomb light enough for air transport? The others have been exceedingly heavy, you know. There must be quite a number of points of that kind." "And that is all we can do as a counterattack," said Phyllis. "All that I have heard of," Dr. Mattit told her cautiously. "The emphasis at the moment is naturally defensive, and on securing safety for ships. There again, that's not my department at all. I can only give you what I've picked up." And he went on to do so. It was generally agreed, it seemed, that ships were liable to 2 forms of attack. 3 forms if one included electrification, but this had occurred only to ships using cables at considerable depths for grappling or other purposes, and could be disregarded as far as the rest were concerned. Neither of these weapons was explosive. The explosions suffered by some of the ships were almost certainly due to their own boilers blowing up when the stoke holes were flooded, for there had been no similar explosions with the motor vessels that had been lost. One of the weapons appeared to be vibratory and capable of setting up sympathetic vibrations of such intensity in the attacked craft that she literally shook herself to pieces in a minute or 2. The other was less obscure in its nature, but even more puzzling in its capacity. It was undoubtedly some contrivance which attacked the hull below the waterline. There were several obvious ways in which a device could be made to do this. What was less comprehensible was its method of assault, since the rapidity with which its victim sank, the fact that the air trapped in the hull blew the decks upwards, and various other effects, all tended to suggest some instrument that was capable not simply of holing a ship, but of something that must be very like slicing the bottom clean off her. Even before the conference had begun, Barker had suggested that these devices might be found to form strategic barrages or minefields about certain deep areas, and might very well be regarded as perimeter defences. There would, he pointed out, be no great difficulty in constructing a mechanism to lurk inertly at any predetermined depth, and become active only on the approach of a ship. That, indeed, had been the principle of both the acoustic and magnetic mines. But on the means by which it could be made to slice through the hull of a ship with apparently the efficiency of a wire through cheese, even Barker had no suggestions to make. No one had disagreed with this in general, but neither had anyone, as yet, been able to amplify it. The suddenness and success of the attacks, the small numbers of the survivors, and the loose quality of their accounts gave very little data. "To my mind," said Dr. Mattit, "the important thing at the moment is to get across to the public that the danger is not incomprehensible, and so stop this silly panicking, for which we may blame the stock exchanges more than any other persons or institutions. The attack comes from an utterly unexpected direction, it is true, but like any other, it can and will be met. And the sooner people can be made to realize that it is simply a matter of finding a counter to a new kind of weapon, the sooner they'll cool off. I gather your job is to cool them off, so that is why I decided to tell you all this. In a few days, I imagine there will be quite full and frank reports from the various committees that are now being set up, once they have been brought to realize that here, at least, is one war in which there are no enemy spies listening." And on that note we parted. Phyllis and I did our best during the next few days to play our part in putting across the idea of firm hands steady on the wheel, and of the backroom boys who had produced radar, ASDIC, and other marvels, nodding confidently and saying, in effect, "Sure, just give us a few days to think, and we'll knock together something that will settle this lot." There was a satisfactory feeling that confidence was gradually being restored. Perhaps the main stabilizing factor, however, emerged from a difference of opinion on one of the technical committees. General agreement had been reached that a torpedo-like weapon designed to give submerged escort to a vessel could profitably be developed to counter the assumed mine form of attack. The motion was accordingly put that all should pool information likely to help in the development of such a weapon. The Russian delegation demurred. Remote control of missiles, they pointed out, was, of course, a Russian invention in any case. Moreover, Russian scientists, zealous in the fight for peace, had already developed such control to a degree greatly in advance of that achieved by the capitalist-ridden science of the West. It could scarcely be expected of the Soviets that they should make a present of their discoveries to warmongers. The Western spokesman replied that while respecting the intensity of the fight for peace, and the fervour with which it was being carried on in every department of Soviet science, except of course the biological, the West would remind the Soviets that this was a conference of peoples faced by a common danger and resolved to meet it by cooperation. The Russian leader responded frankly that he doubted whether, if the West had happened to possess a means of controlling a submerged missile by radio, such as had been invented by Russian engineers working under the inspiration of the world's greatest scientist, the late Joseph Stalin, they would care to share such knowledge with the Soviet people. The Western spokesman assured the Soviet representative that since the West had called the conference for the purpose of cooperation, it felt in duty bound to state that it had indeed perfected such a means of control as the Soviet delegate had mentioned. Following a hurried consultation, the Russian delegate announced that if he believed such a claim to be true, he would also know that it could only have come about through theft of the work of Soviet scientists by capitalist hirelings. And since neither a lying claim nor the admission of successful espionage showed that disinterest in national advantage which the conference had professed, his delegation was left with no alternative but to withdraw. This action, with its reassuring ring of normality, exerted a valuable, tranquilizing influence. Concerning the less easily comprehensible vibratory weapon, it was announced that experiments with damping devices and counter-vibration fields had been begun, and were already showing hopeful results. The conference appointed a research and coordination committee to work in conjunction with UNESCO, another for naval coordination, a standing committee for action, several lesser committees, and adjourned itself pro tem. Amid the widespread satisfaction and resuscitating confidence, the voice of Bocker dissenting rose almost alone. It was late, he proclaimed, but it still might not be too late for some kind of pacific approach to be made to the sources of the disturbance. They had already been shown to possess a technology equal to, if not superior to, our own. In an alarmingly short time they had been able not only to establish themselves, but to produce the means of taking effective action for their self-defense. In the face of such a beginning, one was justified in regarding their powers with respect, and for his part with apprehension. The very differences of environment that they required made it seem unlikely that human interests and those of these xenopathetic intelligences need seriously overlap. Before it should be altogether too late, the very greatest efforts should be made to establish communication with them in order to promote a state of compromise which would allow both parties to live peacefully in their separate spheres. Very likely this was a sensible suggestion, though whether the attempt would ever have produced the desired result is a different matter. In circumstances where there was no will whatever to compromise, however, the only evidence that his appeal had been noticed at all was that the word xenopathetic, and a derived noun xenobath, began to be used in print. "More honoured in the dictionary than in the observance," remarked Bocker with some bitterness. "If it is Greek words they are interested in, there are others. Cassandra, for instance." The decision to avoid crossing the greater deeps proved wise. For several weeks not a ship was reported lost. The market settled down, confidence became convalescent, and the passenger lists began to fill up again, though slowly. Delays and higher freight rates were continuing effects. Nevertheless, there presently arose a disposition to feel that the long-suffering public had once again been stampeded by sensationalism, and the advertising departments of all journals threatened falling revenues unless a note of sprightly plerophory were maintained. Meanwhile, the brains moiled in the back rooms, and after some 4 months, the Admiralty were able to announce that when certain naval craft had been equipped with the new counter-devices, a test would be held over the series of deeps south of Cape Race in the neighbourhood where the Queen Anne had been lost. It is possible that the omission of the press from the test party was due to a lukewarm enthusiasm in demanding its rights. Certainly no representative of my acquaintance was genuinely burning to be included, or it may have been that the authorities were disinclined to take greater risks than necessary. Whatever the cause, there was no correspondent further forward than the reserve ships. For first-hand accounts we had to depend on a somewhat inexpert running commentary and the descriptions given later by the personnel of the test vessels. Phyllis got herself an introduction to a young Lieutenant Royd, and worked on him. When he came back, we took him out to dinner, gave him some drinks, and listened. Well, it turned out to be a piece of cake, he assured us, though, mind you, most of us were feeling pretty windy about it beforehand and didn't mind admitting it. We all sailed together and then hove to some 50 miles short of the deeps, and our party got its stuff all set up. The anti-vibration gadget is a bit wearing at first. In fact, anti isn't quite the word I'd use, because it sets up a constant hum which you can half feel, half hear, but you get used to it after a time. The other gimmick is a tin fish that you sling overboard. A dolphin, they're calling it. It promptly makes a way forward and then settles down to travel about 200 feet ahead of the ship at about 5 fathoms. It's under control, of course, but when it spots anything, it flashes a signal on a screen and goes for it automatically. What its spotting range is, how it spots, and just why it doesn't lash about and go for the parent ship isn't my pigeon. You'll have to ask the boffins if you want to know about that, but in the rough, that's the way it works. Well, when it was all fixed, and the boffins had finished tearing around and testing everything in sight, we set off with the whole ship buzzing like a beehive and the dolphin leading the way, and none of us feeling too good in our bellies. Anyway, I wasn't. Everybody wore jackets, and orders were for all personnel who hadn't duty below to keep on deck just in case. For about 3 hours nothing happened, and the sea looked just like any other sea. Then, while we were wondering whether the whole thing was going to turn out phony, a voice from the hailer said, "Number 1 dolphin away. Make ready number 2 dolphin." The dolphin party had just time to get number 2 swung out when number 1 got home, and did it get home? By the record, it contacted whatever it was after at around 35 fathoms. When it blew, what we saw was several acres of sea going up in the air off the port bow. We raised a bit of a cheer. The hailer came through with, "Lower away there, number 2 dolphin. Stand by number 3 dolphin." Dolphin number 2 went into her sling and ran away forward, and they hitched number 3's sling ready. There was a boffin standing by me looking pretty pleased with himself. He said, "Well, whatever it was, there was some pressure there. A dolphin going up on its own has about a quarter the punch of that." We kept steady on the same course, all looking out like hawks now, though there wasn't anything to be seen. After about 5 minutes, the hailer said, "Dolphin away. Make ready number 3 dolphin." It didn't take so long this time before another lot of sea went up with a whoomph, and number 3 dolphin was lowered away. After that, nothing happened for quite a while. Then the pitch of the humming that we'd got so used to that we didn't notice it began to change so that we did notice it. The boffin beside me gave a grunt and whipped back like a streak into a kind of float-off instrument room they had rigged up on deck. You could feel a sort of trembling in the deck, and the humming kept on changing pitch, and everybody gave a hitch to his life jacket and got ready for something to happen. The thing that did happen was that number 3 dolphin, way ahead of us, blew up. It was a far smaller blow than the others had been, and they reckon it was just the vibrations that set her off. She certainly didn't go for anything. The hailer started to order out number 4 dolphin, and in the middle of that an excited boffin bounced out of the instrument room and ordered the depth charge thrower to work. It lobbed off a couple of spherical containers which just sank. We kept on waiting for a couple of bangs until we realised that they weren't going to come. And that was roughly that. After a bit, the humming settled down to what it had been before, and there was a noise of uproarious boffins slapping one another on the back in the instrument room. We altered course to the north. About an hour later, number 4 dolphin went up with a thundering good wham. The boffins, all of them pretty tight by this time, tumbled out on deck to cheer and sing Steamboat Bill, and that was about the end of it. We still had number 5 dolphin running serenely ahead of us when we reckoned we were clear of the area. A nice lad, Lieutenant Royd, but not perhaps a source of technical information. However, it was eyewitness stuff we were after. We knew in a general way how the dolphins worked, and we had heard that the spheres launched by the mine thrower were intended to home on the source of the vibrations, and were capable of reaching far greater depths than the dolphins. Even if it had been explained to us exactly how they did it, we should probably not have understood.
The Kraken Wakes was written by John Wyndham and read by Stephen Moore. The programme was produced by Susan Carson.